What is up, everyone? Today we're going to be talking about tuples in Python. So what exactly is a tuple and how does it actually differ from lists? So in the last video we had a shopping list example where we had a list with, shopping list items. And remember, a square bracket denotes that it's actually a list. So how does a tuple actually look like? Well, this is an example of a tuple. So a tuple, as you can see here, the main difference is that there's actually parentheses and not brackets. So is that the only difference? Well, for starters, you can actually have a tuple without parentheses at all. This is technically considered a tuple. This is also a tuple. So you don't actually need the parentheses, but a lot of times you'll see them with parentheses. So is that the main difference? Is that the only difference? Other than this bracket difference, what is the main difference of these different types? Well, the main difference is that a tuple is actually known as immutable. So what immutable means is that it cannot change. So remember how in the last video we can easily change a value. Say I wanted to change the element at index 0 to be, let's call it, change it to be apples. Let's say I like apples now, I don't want bananas. So I can easily change this, right? There's no issue, right? But when I try and do the same thing with a tuple, right? Let's say I do the same thing and say, you know what, change banana to apples. What's going to happen is you're going to get an error, which says tuple object does not support item assignment. Essentially what that means is a tuple, right, does not actually allow you to change items. You cannot assign a new item, to an item that's already there. You cannot change the element's value or delete an element. You cannot do that. So that's the main difference between tuples and lists. Another thing to note is that as you can recall in the last video, I talked that a list can have, different data types. It can have an int, it could have a float, it could have a boolean, right? But while a tuple can have the same thing, right? Best practice is to use a tuple when you have different data types. So in here I have different data types, and you should use a list when you have the same data type. So in this case I have all strings. This is just best practice. It won't throw an error if you don't actually follow this, but this is just best practice. So choose to follow that if you wish. And so another thing is that you might say, well, when should I use tuples and when should I use lists other than that? The main difference is, again, when you have a list of data, or you have, elements that you know that we're not going to change. So you know that these elements are never going to change, or you don't actually want to change them or update them or delete them, then you should be using a tuple, because a tuple does not allow you to change them or delete them. So it's better to use a tuple, and you should use a tuple in this case. And in cases where you have a list where, for instance, you might want to change the elements or the values, then you should be using a list. So those are the main differences, and that's how you can actually define a tuple. Well, you might say, what if actually I had a tuple that only had one element? So, you can have a list with only one element, right? That's totally fine. But how would you do that in a tuple? Would you define something like this? Let's say I wanted to have a tuple of only, one item, call it banana, right? Would you do something like this? Well, let's actually try and see what type this is. This is actually type of, when you print this, what type is this? It's actually a type string. Well, why is that? Well, because Python doesn't actually know that this is a tuple. Even if you have parentheses, it doesn't actually know. Like if I take out the parentheses, obviously this looks like a string, so it's obviously a string, right? But even if I put parentheses, it's still considered a string. So how you can actually define a tuple with a single value is you must add a comma at the end. So whether you have parentheses or you don't have parentheses, to make it a tuple you have to add a comma at the end if it's a singular tuple, right? So now, as you can see, it's of type tuple, right? So that's how you can define a tuple. Now another thing to note is that, let's say I had these, let's just remove this just because, it doesn't really make sense, shopping list. I had these elements and I want to actually, define a variable and assign this value to a variable and assign this variable to another, assign this value to another variable, assign this value to another variable. So I can do something like this, right? Something simple like this, and then do the same thing with potato, milk. But there's actually a better way, something called unpacking. So first of all, when you have no parentheses, right? When you have a tuple that looks like this with no parentheses, this is actually known as packing, or a packed tuple. A packed tuple is basically one that doesn't have parentheses, right? But the most important thing I want to talk about is an unpacking. Unpacking a tuple means basically something like this. So I'm going to define 3 variables, and I'm going to assign a value, shopping tuple. Well, you might say, well, what's going on here? You're actually assigning one object, which is a tuple, to three variables with commas. What is going on here exactly? Well, what's going on here is I'm actually unpacking these values in this tuple and assigning them to each variable. So imagine this, right? I'm assigning the value of banana to this variable fruit. And then I go on to the next element in the tuple, so potato, and I'm assigning that to the next variable I've defined, so vegetable. And then I assign the third value to the third variable. So notice when I actually print these variables, notice what the value of these variables are, right? So when I print them, what actually happens is, I get the first value, the first variable has a value of banana, right, which is the first element. Second one's potato, third one's milk, right? So essentially what you're doing is you're saying, okay, I have this tuple here, I want to map the first element to the first variable, the second to the second, the third to the third. Well, you might say, what if I actually do something like this? I don't know, call this clothes. I don't know. So when you run this, you get an error because it says there's not enough values to unpack, right? So what you're trying to do is you're actually trying to assign values in the tuple to each variable. But in this case, I actually have four variables. So okay, I assign this to this, I assign this to this, I assign this to this, but then what do I assign to this? There's not enough elements or values in the tuple to assign to all these variables, right? So you need to make sure that you have the same amount of variables as the same amount of elements in your tuple that you're actually unpacking, right? So again, you don't need to do this. This is just a quick way if you ever find a need to do something like this where you assign each element in a tuple to a variable, right? In one way, you can do that easily, right? So now how do you actually access, oops, I shouldn't have deleted that. How do you actually access elements? So similar to a list, to access an element, you can easily do first of all, reference the tuple name, and then open square brackets, and then put the index. So index 0 would be at this index, so element banana. When you print this, you get banana, right? And if I do something like 2, right, it should be milk. So it's the same way. And then you might say, well, that's cool, but can I actually access a range of elements as we did with lists? Can I actually access with slicing? Can I do that? Sure, you can. You can start off by, again, how does this work? Slicing works where you first define the first element you want to start at. So I want to start at potato, which is at index 1, right? And then colon, and then I put the index of the element that I want to stop at. So I want to get 1, and I want to get milk, which is at 2, and then I want to stop when I hit 3. So I should put 3. So basically it's going to get elements at 1 and 2, which are potato and milk. And as you can see here, that's exactly what I get, right? So now you know how to actually access elements, and you know how to actually define different elements. So another thing to note is that you cannot delete, right? You cannot delete elements. You can't, right? It doesn't make sense. You cannot, because it's immutable. You can't change the tuple. What you can do is delete the whole thing. So I can actually delete the entire thing. And what's going to happen though is that it's going to actually delete the whole thing, and you can no longer call this variable, or it's not defined anymore. So I basically said delete this tuple, and I tried to print this tuple, and what ends up happening is it says error, the shopping tuple name is not defined, because basically I deleted it. So now this variable is actually undefined. So another thing you can do is, say you had a shopping tuple and you said, you know what, I actually want to change the tuple, but I know I can't actually add a new element. I can't do that. So what I can do actually is I can actually reassign a new tuple to this variable. So I can say, you know what, assign a new tuple, I don't know, carrots, honey, for instance. So basically, you're not actually changing the tuple, right? Because you can't. What you're doing is you're saying, okay, I'm not going to change the tuple, but I'm going to change the value of this variable. So I'm going to reassign a new tuple that I've just defined here, and that's totally fine, right? There's no issue. When you print this, it gives you the variable now is equal to a new tuple that you've assigned. So there's no error because you're not actually changing the values of a tuple, you're just giving a new tuple to a variable. That's it. Another thing you can do is you can actually add or concatenate two tuples into one new tuple. So say I wanted to have a shopping list with this, and I had these two variables. So what I can do is I can actually add these two together and say add shopping tuple 1 and shopping tuple 2. So what it's going to do is going to take this tuple and take this tuple and add them together to make one new tuple. So what you can see here, I get one new tuple with both tuples added together with all their elements together. So now this is one new tuple, right? So you're not really changing the tuple, you're just adding them together to make a new tuple. So that's kind of how you can, this is kind of like a use case where if you needed to add two tuples together and you can't really add to a specific tuple one by one, you can add another tuple to it. All right, so there's actually two other methods that are built in with tuples. So let's actually take a look at those. So remember with arrays we had, or lists, we had something like insert or append, right? So we have something similar, well not a similar method, but we have methods in tuples. So I have a method called count. And basically what count's going to do is going to count the number of occurrences of a value. So I'm going to say shopping tuple.count. I'm going to give it a value to count. So I'm going to say, you know what, I want you to count how many times the value or the element banana occurs in this tuple. So obviously there's 2, so it should be printing 2, right? And you can also use another method called index. What index is going to do is going to say, give me the value, give me the index of the first occurrence of this value. So it's going to check this tuple and say, okay, I'm looking for banana. So in our luck, the first element is actually banana. So it's going to say, okay, well, as soon as you find this element, give me the index of where that element is. So in this case, index is 0, so it should be giving us 0, right? Okay guys, so that's the basics of how tuples works and how you can actually use them and when you should use them in comparison to lists. In the next video, I'm going to be talking about lists and tuples together with more advanced stuff or things that I haven't covered, just so you guys can have a full understanding and a better understanding of tuples and lists. So thanks for watching guys. Make sure to stay tuned, like and subscribe.